SECfans.com. Week 11. We are rolling through, and now we're starting to get into some games that really matter. We're only going to talk about 3 this week: Alabama, Mississippi State, Georgia, and Auburn, which is a huge one as well. And we're going to step outside the SEC and talk about Notre Dame and Miami. But first, I don't know if we do this just by accident or whatever, but every week we always start with Alabama, so let's keep it going that way. Let's start with Alabama. Alabama, Mississippi State. Usually we talk about Alabama's opponent first because we always we spend so much time on Alabama since they're good or whatever. But I want to talk about Alabama first this week, and namely how concerned Alabama fans should be given the struggles that they had. There's a little bit of struggle on offense, and they only gave up 10 points on defense. So you look at it and say 24-10 is a pretty clean win. We're not doing transitive property here for you Mississippi State fans that haven't seen us a lot. We're going to run a computer model later. It's a little more honest to the data than transitive property, but they had some of those same struggles on offense that we saw with Jalen Hurts and not being clicking in the pass game, not being able to run against LSU. And this sort of bear showed up last year, first time. They were rolling, hit LSU and couldn't get it done. And then they had all of these injuries at linebacker on the defensive side of the ball. And I want to start there. So let's talk about how worried are you right now, given the fact that they've lost about 100 linebackers due to injury this year, and half of those are for the season.
Well, I'm not so worried at this exact second about where they're at. I think Holcomb is a strong enough player. I think that he can handle himself. I think he was a guy that would start for a lot of other teams, but I'm not sure that he's Sean Deion Hamilton against the run. And I'm not sure that he's necessarily Mac Wilson in a lot of other ways. He's a versatile player. I think he's probably a little too tall and lanky, has a hard time getting off blocks, but he's a heady player. He's pretty smart. He just sometimes gets caught in the wash a little bit. They're going to suffer from that. And Sean Deion Hamilton, he was a valedictorian, very smart player, knew everything was lined up, and it's tough to replace a guy like that. So I do think it's a bad thing. I think the inability to rotate the way they've been doing hurts them. They love the fact that they had a lot of guys that could play, and they had a lot of different players that played in different sets, so they could practice those guys at a specific formation in specific situations. And now everybody's going to play a lot more responsibilities. The good thing is that with Holcomb and Evans, you've got two guys that have played a ton. So it's not like you're having to replace him with a young guy that maybe doesn't know all the formations. I think what's kind of the opposite is true. They've replaced young guys in specific situations who are very good at their role with a more all-around player in Holcomb, who's probably going to be decent against the pass, but particularly Auburn and Georgia are extremely run-heavy teams. It's probably a loss because they're not the guy that Sean Deion Hamilton was in his ability to read gaps and shoot them. LSU's long touchdown play came when Sean Deion Hamilton's out and Keith Holcomb basically gets pancaked and runs right up the gut. There's another aspect to that I think that gets missed. The thing that really springs that play for what it's worth, and this is kind of an aside, but their safety, Hootie Jones, crashes inside, gets engaged with an offensive lineman. He should have been way more back. And if he's back, the offensive line never gets to him.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that because Nick Saban in his post-game press conference talked specifically about that play and is really pissed. He talked about two things. You know, when you get a big, tough win against an opponent that plays you hard, he usually doesn't care if it's close or whatever. He doesn't kill his team in the presser. He killed 2 people in the presser, or 2 groups, I guess. Freshman drops, he mentioned that. And then he mentioned the one long play, didn't mention it specifically, and he said half the team did everything right, the other half did everything wrong. He said had either one of them done the same, so if they'd all done everything right or if they'd all done everything wrong, they would have been fine. But I think he was singling out Holcomb in that play.
Yeah, I think both of them had trouble. Holcomb sort of played back and let himself get engaged and run over, and if he'd crashed the line, he could have at least disrupted it. And the opposite was true with Hootie Jones, that came in hard and got himself engaged with the lineman, and he wasn't back there to make the tackle. If Hootie's on his heels, then Geis is going to come through, or I can't remember if it's Geis or Williams, with a head of steam, and Hootie's probably going to get blown up, but he'll get blown up 10 yards downfield. As it was, they're both at the line of scrimmage, and he comes through and there's nobody behind him. So, I mean, that's all a concern, but at the end of the day, I still think quietly the middle linebackers are in better shape than the outside linebackers. The outside linebackers, I thought, didn't generate much pass rush in that game. And I also think they were really not very disruptive on the edges. They didn't do a whole lot on the jet sweeps. I know they had limited responsibilities. They put McMillan in late, I think because they wanted his size, but I felt like he didn't really contribute anything. Jamie Mosley got banged up in that game and was in and out. He generally struggles with the edge just due to a size problem. Anthony Jennings, I think, is a pretty darn good player if he's healthy, but we're yet to see him healthy really all season. And it's a concern. And I think middle linebacker and linebacker is going to be okay as long as they don't lose another guy. I think if they do lose another guy, they're going to be real serious trouble. I think, however, when you're talking about linebackers, the issue is still the outside linebacking core. I think they're razor thin, and they had too many guys banged up. And I'll put this in perspective because I know fans of other teams listen to this, and I know a lot of Georgia fans are sort of following it, and I don't know if they ever jump in. But if you were thinking about Georgia, if Georgia lost Lorenzo Carter, Natris Patrick, Roquan Smith, Reggie Carter, and DeAndre Walker, where would they be? Because those are the same guys in the same slot that Alabama's lost. And I think it's a testament to what they've done that they've been able to replace them. But at the same time, they're not going to be the team they would have been if they had Christian Miller and Terrell Hall and Sean Dion Hamilton in that lineup. And Mac Wilson may be back in a few weeks, but at that point it may already be after the Auburn and Georgia game where they really need him. Maybe they can use him in the playoff, but they got to get to the playoff first. So it's a serious concern going forward. I think the defense still played at a high level, but I'm not sure they can be necessarily as dominant without those guys. You need elite linebackers to be a dominant defense. I don't know that they have enough left to really be a dominant defense, and they're going to have to instead be a gritty defense that's going to rely on young players to make plays.
Yeah, it's interesting to see. Everybody talks about Saban wins a lot of times because he's got the Jimmies and Joes. He's going to have to actually coach his way to a patchwork defense being effective because you could see the drop off. And Jennings was hurt too in that game. Jennings and Mosley were playing hobbled, and the fact that they're playing hobbled tells you how much depth they really don't have behind them. Okay, let's talk about the offense real quick, and then we'll get into sort of Mississippi State and then both these teams together. We've seen Alabama 2 years in a row now, just rolling on offense. Hit A&M, slow down a little bit, and then hit LSU and kind of hit a brick wall. And they didn't hit a brick wall this game. They scored, 3 touchdowns. I think one was a short field, and then the field goal. But they did have some misfires, and they did show that if you can stop the run, and that's a possibility, like teams can stop Alabama from running. We saw LSU do it, last night. Then it puts some pressure on Jalen, and he doesn't always hit his man or find the open receiver. They were playing single safety last night, 8-man front, and you've got to be able to throw him that. And sometimes he was successful, and sometimes he wasn't. Tell me what you saw with Jalen Hurts and this Alabama offense last night. And should Alabama fans be worried about that, given that you and I both agree that it was, even though the defense gave up a lot of points against Clemson, it was the offense that actually lost them the game in the national championship last year?
First off, I actually thought Hurts played pretty well. The reality of that game is they had a lot of drops. You already mentioned the freshman drops. At least 2 of them I know were third down conversions that were dropped, and that's brutal for an offense because when you drop those plays, that's 2 third down conversions, which is essentially 2 extra drives, if you want to think about it that way. That's a drive that ended on that play that became a punt, that became an LSU drive, that if they convert it, it's as if they immediately finished where their current drive ended. They would have, in that theoretical world, started a new drive 10 yards or 15 yards downfield. That's a big shift. So that hurt from a production standpoint and a statistical standpoint. I think there were 2 or 3 missed pass interferences, which I don't bring up penalties a lot. In fact, I almost never bring up penalties. Anytime you play in these big games, you don't see a lot of penalties. And Alabama, I think, has been consistently 129th or 130th nationally in opponent penalties. The reality is when you play in a big game, referees let the quote unquote let the kids play, and they allow a lot of holds. They allow a lot of physical contact with the DBs. I think probably a lot of teams probably get frustrated when they play Alabama and feels like they don't get any holds called against Alabama. No one that plays Alabama gets holds called against them either. It's a double-sided sword every time you play that team, that you're going to get referees that are going to let it play it out, because you're playing the number 1 or number 2 team in the country, and they don't like to get overly involved. But in this one, there were a couple of instances where I think they missed pretty bad pass interferences. One,
and I think real quick, I think it's important that you pointed out pass interferences and not holds or face masks or late hits, because when you're playing single safety 8-man front and your corners and your DBs are playing man, and you can get away with pass interference. And again, we're not complaining about the refs. I'm sure Alabama interfered as well. You're having to sell out essentially for the run, and that's what LSU did, and it worked. But what that does is that leaves you exposed in the pass game. And if you're making the team that has the advantage in the pass game, if you're making the receivers literally play with one hand tied behind your back, that's a huge advantage for the defense. It's like playing with an extra man or two.
There was one play in particular that was a deep touchdown pass that was a go route to Devontae Smith in the end zone, where the DB was about a half second early, and he tomahawk chopped Smith's arms and pinned him to his body. No receiver can catch that ball if you let the DB do that. Now, it was kind of a bang-bang play, and I know they talked about that on the broadcast. I understand all that, but what we're talking about right now is how Jalen Hurts did. That's not Jalen Hurts' fault. Jalen Hurts can't force the referees to throw a flag or the receiver to overcome the contact. He put the ball where it needed to be for a touchdown on that play. I felt like that happened a lot. He had a lot of pressure. There were sometimes he held the ball on too long. I don't dispute that at all, but he really did a pretty good job of making reads. He threw a couple slants that were very impressive. I know 1 or 2 of them bounced off his guys' chests. Now, I will give the freshmen a lot of credit, because I don't think they ever touched a ball without a DB making contact with them. And it's easy to misunderstand how hard it is to catch the ball if you're being hit and all of a sudden your hands, your body's redirected. You still hope they make the catch, but from Jalen's perspective, he did everything that you really want him to do in those situations. I might go so far as to say, really and truly, that might have been the best game of his career. And there were some plays, the Cam Smith throw, which to some degree was ill-advised, but it was in the one place it needed to be, and just a lot of clutch conversion throws for first downs that I don't think he would have ever made in the past. And it would have just taken a few of those that were caught to make a big impact on the game. And this whole game really was one touchdown away, I felt like, from Alabama really running away with it. I always felt like they were in control, but it was right at the precipice where if LSU had ever scored a touchdown more than they did at any point, it would have been a really serious, tense ball game. And if Alabama had ever scored another touchdown, I would have felt like it was completely out of reach. And as it was just Alabama in control, but hadn't quite put it away the entire night. 31-10 would have been a serious blowout, and somehow 24-10 has felt like a fairly close game that Alabama pulled away, and really just those few of those catches would have made the difference.
Yeah, it's funny because that just illustrates how spoiled Alabama fans are. I think it was Gage said in the post-game presser that he wasn't going to sit there and praise Alabama. He felt like if they hit a couple of those deep shots that they beat Alabama, which is, it's easy to say, harder to do. But on the flip side, Alabama's driving late in the second quarter, would have been the last possession for either team. Late in the second quarter, and Smith drops that ball, that long post, that if they score there, it's like 21-0, 21-3 at the half, and it completely changes the complexion of that game. I'm not making excuses one way or the other. It is always interesting to see just how close games are to being super close, or just how close games are to being complete blowouts. So we're saying all this, and Mississippi State fans are sitting there going, yeah, that's great and all, but we beat the crap out of LSU. And so now is when we talk about the Jekyll and Hyde that is Mississippi State, because Alabama fans are going to turn around and say, okay, you beat the crap out of LSU, but you played 2 good teams on your schedule and got blown out. And you struggled really bad last week with UMass. So What to make of this Mississippi State team? I think we know at this point they've got some ability. They're a good football team that maybe didn't show up in these couple other games, but is it possible that Mississippi State was completely sold out early, 2 weeks early, preparing for Alabama, and they just were sleepwalking against UMass? Or are there some warning signs we see from Mississippi State in their play in this game headed into Bama?
I think the first thing to address is the comment you made about LSU and they blew out LSU. We made a lot of predictions. And going into last week, we were 15-3-2. We didn't manage to keep that mark quite, but we're still very, very good with our model against the spread. Of those misses, 2 of them were LSU. LSU, Mississippi State, LSU, Auburn. And the third was Mississippi State against Georgia. Mississippi State and LSU have played up and down all season, and one of the big reasons we do a model is really to give an objective baseline to say, here is something that doesn't use any of our own personal inputs. I use entirely historical data. Now there's always some subjectivity in the way you do construct it, but as much as possible, I try to let history drive the result. And in that model, we've seen wildly inconsistent results from LSU and Mississippi State all year. And I say that because I don't think you can necessarily reconcile some of the results. And if you try to apply transitive property with either one of these teams, I don't think it really works. Your question of do we have concerns with Mississippi State? I do. And the reason for that is we saw Mississippi State blow out Texas A&M. We saw Mississippi State blow out LSU. Both really good games. And then in my view, we've seen Mississippi State, I think they blew out Kentucky, struggled horribly against UMass. They got destroyed by Georgia. They get destroyed by Auburn. Like you said, it's Jekyll and Hyde. For every great game they've had a terrible one. Now, statistically, it's kind of easy to differentiate them because in the games where they've done extremely well, they've generally held teams to under 4 yards per carry. And the only real exception to that would be LSU, where it was about 4.5 yards per carry. But still, if teams have over 4.5 yards per carry, they've destroyed them. And if teams have had under 4.5 yards a carry, Mississippi State's destroyed the team they're playing. That's been pretty consistent. But in my personal opinion, I think Mississippi State doesn't have a ton of talent. And a lot of what they're doing is about exploiting deficiencies in other teams, particularly schematically and discipline issues. And they're also straining linebackers and athleticism. And when I say that, we pointed out during the LSU game, they didn't score with their main receivers. Their leading receiver by far in that game was Keith Mixon. He's not a traditional receiver. He's under 6 foot. What he is a scat player that's explosive. And they did a lot of stuff to get LSU out of position, and LSU broke coverage, and they just threw to an open Mixon on 2 or 3 of their big touchdown plays. And that's how they blew that game open. Now, I think also, again, and this goes for Alabama too, LSU is a completely different team defensively than they were early in the year. Their injuries to defensive tackle were devastating around the time of the Mississippi State game and the Troy game. With Rashard Lawrence, healthy Rashard Lawrence in the lineup, they're almost a completely different team. And I think you have to keep that in mind. But I think the more important thing is what Mississippi State was able to do offensively versus LSU and what they were able to do offensively against Texas A&M, 2 teams that played Alabama really tough and close. And then they were completely ineffective against Georgia and Auburn. Well, LSU beat Auburn. So we have some data points there. I think LSU's defense, when they're playing up to a standard, is comparable. I just don't think LSU was as well coached. And early in the year, they weren't nearly as well coached. I think LSU probably pulls that game out now, honestly. They're such a different team. But where I think Mississippi State may struggle in this game is I don't think Alabama's going to be caught as out of position. I think Alabama's safeties are very good, which is an underrated point. We don't know how Minkah Fitzpatrick was, who's another guy that got banged up in that last game. Be a really big deal if he's healthy. But I think Alabama, even with all the injuries at linebacker, which I think definitely could come into play in this game, is still pretty darn talented. And they've got the guys to sort of set the edge, and I don't think they're going to make the huge mistakes to leave guys being wide open. I haven't seen anything that makes me think Fitzgerald is going to be able to use the passing game alone against a high-level team. That's been, in my opinion, their great weakness. They have to get you off balanced and then hit big plays. They remind me a lot of maybe 2014 Auburn, where their offense was extremely explosive in times, but it was all sort of pop plays. They didn't run a conventional offense, and they had to be able to get you with a run and get you off balance and hit big plays to work. And if you could sort of control those, then that system broke down. And that's what Mullen's doing. And he's doing a good job with the talent he has, but it's a lot of smoke and mirrors. And if you can play him straight up to where you don't strain your defense and people can play without having to overthink things or blitz and really just focus on their assignment in a standard set, I don't know that Mississippi State has the horses to beat you one-on-one.
And to give Alabama fans a little bit of point of reference, and you might tell me this is a crazy comparison, especially considering these two teams played each other and their offenses are so different, but what you just said reminds me a lot of LSU offensively, not because they run similar systems, because they really don't, but LSU relies on home run plays. They need a 78-yarder on a jet sweep. They need a special team score. If they do those things, then they're in a game with a heavy hitter. If they don't do those things, they're rarely going to drive the ball 80 yards and get a touchdown on a high-level defense consistently throughout a game. They have to have those things. Are there some similarities there, or are they so totally different that they don't really apply?
I think there are a lot of similarities, and they do things in a different way. Mississippi State doesn't have the receiving talent that LSU has, and I'm not saying the receivers are necessarily better at LSU, which is a weird thing to say, but the talent level of the receivers, their speed, size, and athleticism is elite at LSU right now. Gage and Chark can get that stick and edge, and they can run over people. Not many teams have that. And what Mississippi State does have, though, is a quarterback that is excellent with the run. We've talked about this a lot. I'm not going to rehash it too much since we talked about it at length against Auburn last week. Excuse me, not last week, but in Mississippi State's last game. Nick Fitzgerald has really, really good run stats. And if you looked at his, run stat EPA and his QBR, it's really high, but he's one of the worst passers in the country in terms of estimated points added in ESPN's QBR metric. In other words, QBR is a combination of run metrics and pass metrics. If you look at just his pass metrics, he's bottom 10. If you look at his total QBR, though, he's a top 10, top 20 player. Why is that? Because he's top 10 in what he adds with the run. He is at times almost a wildcat quarterback, and I know people feel like I'm selling him short because while he can make every throw on the field, he can't make every throw with consistency. So you've really got to make sure he's in the pocket. And Mississippi State, you talk about what they do with big plays. Well, a lot of what they do with big plays, and it's what they did against Texas A&M, is they get you thinking run and inside run and focused on the traditional offense. And then they get Nick Fitzgerald on the edge, and he's a load. And a lot of teams, their secondary can't handle him, or their back seven can't handle him. That combination of size and speed, and before you know it, he's running down the field. And it was a couple of those big plays that really blew open the Texas A&M game. And I think when teams have had the athleticism at linebacker and safety to really contain him, the offense has suffered tremendously as a result.
All right, so one more thing before we get into numbers, because I think that'll tell us a lot about this game. We've had some seasons with Mississippi State in the past where their record and their season was a bit of a mirage in that, they'll come into the Alabama game 8-0, 8-1, whatever, really highly ranked, and then lose a bunch in the back half of their schedule because it was super backloaded. I think this year, and tell me if I'm wrong, I think this year we've had a good enough mixture of good and bad, high-level opponents and not, to know that they've earned the record they have, and there isn't a mirage. We're getting the Mississippi State team that we're going to get, well-coached team, can score some points. They've shown they can hang with some big guys. They've shown they can blow out the bad guys. Like, is that fair to say that this is a little bit different team this year? That the record that they have, the pretty clean record that they have, is a testament to how good they are, not a testament to how crappy the opponents they played.
I think so. We said early in the year that we thought they were a lot better than we were expecting. We were not very high in Fitzgerald. I think what he did for them with the run game was a lot more than we anticipated. I think you have to some extent throw out the Georgia and Auburn games because when those teams are on, they're extremely good. And to a certain extent, Georgia and Auburn just have athletes that Mississippi State can't match up with. I do step back a little bit because they did struggle a little too much against UMass, and note that at times I think you can see where talent is a limitation. And it goes back to what I said earlier. Mullen has been a very good X's and O's coach. He has not been a very good recruiter, and he really has not been a good recruiter, frankly. So it's kind of limited their ceiling. When they've had the talent to be able to compete, they've been very good. When they're able to get guys out of position and sort of exploit things where the other team's deficient, the X's and O's have been able to take over. But at times they just kind of get overwhelmed. So I don't know. I think to some extent they are the team we thought they were. But I think maybe we underestimated how good that team would be. The fact that they maybe don't have the horses to hang with an Auburn or a Georgia doesn't mean that they're not going to be able to beat everybody else and then punk an LSU team that doesn't play very disciplined football. But, you look back at the UMass game, they're a team that would throw for 5.6 yards per attempt against UMass. That's not great. And Nick Fitzgerald really won them the game with his legs, rushing for 135 yards and 17 carries at 7.9 yards per attempt. But you really don't want to be playing major teams, the Alabamas of the world, in situations where your quarterback averages 2 or 3 yards per carry more than he averages yards per attempt. That's just not ideal. You want to have a real passing attack to be able to maintain real balance. And maybe they can exploit the injuries at linebacker. That's actually a really interesting question to see, and I don't think we know the answer to it. But, I think they're a team that has made the most of the opportunities put in front of them, to put it that way. And I don't know that they're a great football team, but I think they've sort of maximized their season. And they do seem to do that every year. I think it's a real testament to Dan Mullen and what he's been able to do as a coach. But I also think that there's a little bit of concern to me, as there has been for the past several years, that I don't see a lot to make me feel like he's ever going to get past that hump. And, as we move into the prediction for this game, it's a real concern because yet again, I think they are significantly overmatched in terms of talent.
Yeah, and Mississippi State fans are going to roll their eyes and say, yeah, that's what you said A&M game. That's what you said LSU game. But we're going to do it like we always do it, and we're going to keep it real with the numbers. Yes, I said keep it real, and I meant it. Okay, so let's talk about the computer model. I don't think we need to explain the computer model at this point. It's week 11, second year of us doing this. Both of these fan bases, if they're watching this show, know what we do with the computer model. And if not, they can kind of infer when you talk about the statistics and the measurements that we're going to see. So get into the computer model. Let us know what it says and tell us what you think.
These teams represent good, balanced offenses with potent rushing attacks. But the biggest differences are on defense. And I think there's a perception that Mississippi State is a really good defense. But what we tend to look at here with per play averages is how you do relative to your opponents. And Mississippi State, despite some of their good games, is still giving up 90% against the pass, 91% against the run. Now that's good. 90 to 95% is good, but it's not really great. We really want to break that 90% threshold to be a great team. They're merely a good one defensively. And as much as they're balanced, they only are averaging 5.7 yards per attempt on the season. A lot of people would look at that UMass game and feel like it was uncharacteristically struggling. I think it's important to understand that Nick Fitzgerald's average in that game was right at his season average. 5.7 yards per attempt on the season, 5.6 yards per attempt in that UMass game. That is who they are offensively. So when you look at that, it's a concern because Alabama, even with injuries and everything else, they're giving up 59% of opponents' averages against the run. And that's kind of a crazy low number. And against the pass, this is one of the better units they've had. They're giving up 73% against the pass. So you've got to be really good offensively to move the ball. And we've talked about it a lot before. Pass defense numbers never come as low as rush defense. You can be a really good defense to shut down the run, but I think the best we've ever modeled maybe hit something like 68% against the pass, but you're always 70% or above. So if you think about it, if you're a team that averages 10 yards per attempt, about the best defense you'll ever see is going to maybe hold you to 7 yards per attempt, generally on average. Mississippi State is not a pass-first team, and that's the problem currently with this model. They're not going to do a ton to slow down Alabama. We looked at LSU last week. Statistically, their defense is better against the run by a little bit. Now, we questioned that because LSU's numbers were so bizarre based off their injury situation, but they're not nearly as good against the pass. And we've also talked about this last year, that they were 100th or worse in pass defense statistics. That has been their Achilles heel. And we talked about what happened with Auburn and Georgia. My opinion in those two games, if you were to try to figure out what happened, why were the Auburn and Georgia results the way they were, it's that Auburn and Georgia represented teams with good quarterbacks that could execute in important situations. And that's not something Mississippi State has faced a lot of this season. They really haven't faced teams that are overly good as passing offenses. But in those Georgia and Auburn games where they played, Brigham Young, Kentucky, Mond at A&M was kind of a disaster. LSU's offense was completely out of sync early. But Georgia and Auburn, they gave up over 16 yards per play when they were passing the football, 16 yards per attempt. That's horrific. So to me, that's sort of where you're at. It's Mississippi State needs to run to be successful, and they're playing a team that's excellent against the run. And Mississippi State really struggles when they play a team that can pass the ball. We've already talked about the LSU game may have been sort of a slugfest, but 7.6 yards per attempt is actually pretty darn decent by Hurts in that game. 7.6 yards per attempt, to put that in perspective, that's better than they did against Vanderbilt. I mean, people feel like the Vanderbilt game was an utter blowout, and it was because of the rushing attack, but Hurts had a higher per attempt average against LSU than he did against Vanderbilt. That's why this thing gets out of hand. The model has a prediction of Alabama 34, Mississippi State 6, and I wanted to do all that to introduce it to explain. It's really twofold. It's one, Mississippi State depends on the run in order to be effective. Alabama stops the run at a really considerable clip. And two, Alabama may not be an elite passing offense, but they're beginning to be a pretty good one. And when Mississippi State, has played teams that have a significant amount of balance offensively, the defense has not been able to beat it. They basically, I think, have to compensate one way or the other. They can't play teams straight up and handle them athletically. So really on both sides of the ball, just like Auburn and Georgia, our model is saying this is a really rough matchup, and 34-6 is the predicted result.
It's interesting. You touched on a lot of interesting storylines in this game, especially with Alabama defensive injuries. For me, the Alabama offense is still there, and I think, as you said, they've shown that they can step up when they need to. They've been pretty consistent this year. 24 points is a lot more than they scored against LSU last year, and they were a lot more effective against LSU this year. Now, I don't think it's as good of an LSU defense, but that's another story. What I do find interesting is that 7.6 number, because if you remember when Auburn had to throw the ball against LSU, their receivers couldn't get open, and Stidham really struggled. They were able to run in the first quarter, get to that 20-0 lead, and then when it was Auburn's offense, their subpar by SEC standard wide receivers up against that LSU secondary, they really struggled. We didn't see that with Alabama as much. I don't necessarily agree with the model, and the model can't take into consideration the fact that Alabama's really banged up on defense, and they almost need another bye week this week after what they just showed. And I think what we talked about earlier with guys like Holcomb and people who aren't really deeply immersed in the complexities of this defense, which means you can't play as fast, or you play fast and make mistakes really quickly. I think they're going to give up more points here, especially with the big play possibility from Miss State. But I think Alabama's still going to get there. So I like the 34, but give me 17 points for Mississippi State. 34-17, I could see it not – I could see Mississippi State finding a way to shorten this game and maybe them not getting as many points and Alabama not getting as many points, being like a 28-11 type deal. But if I'm going on the record, give me 34-17.
Right. And for my part, I mostly agree with you. The number I have in my head is 41-17. Same thing. I think Alabama's injuries at linebacker kind of cripple them a little bit. I think if they were completely healthy at linebacker, frankly, they would probably shut down Mississippi State offensively. They're not. And that's going to be an issue that's going to cause them to give up some long drives. But at the same time, a lot of what we saw against LSU was, I won't call it bad luck because it's not like it's luck that they dropped the ball, but from a statistical perspective, from a predictive perspective, I don't expect them to drop that many passes in a ball game normally. And I can't predict off that. And if they did catch those, they're a more effective offense by a significant margin. Mississippi State is not nearly as good against the pass, I think, as LSU, and their corners are not anywhere, frankly, on the same planet. Not many teams are. I think Alabama's going to have a lot more offensive success than people expect. I think they may rebound offensively in this game. And if Mississippi State is moving the ball well, I think Alabama has to score more to try to keep distance. And that's where I come up with a 41-17 prediction.
I don't hate that. I think we saw that. You mentioned that against Arkansas, where, you know, when they went away from Allen and went to Kelly, he was more of that vertical shot guy. But you said if Allen was in the game and healthy and their offense was clicking, you might see Alabama beat them even more or score more points because they felt the need to keep pace with an offense that really threatened them. If Alabama's defense has some concerns, either not as gap sound against a running quarterback or is going to give up a big play, then I agree with you. I think you could see them maybe trying to lean on their offense to score even more early to maintain the level of comfort that they're used to. Anything else on Alabama and Mississippi State?
Well, I'll add to that one statement that I think that holds true even coming out of the LSU game. They kind of shut it down in the fourth quarter. It wasn't an insurmountable lead, but they weren't going to put the ball in the air with any risk of turning it over. And Alabama ended that game inside the 10-yard line, kneeing the ball out. Alabama could have put up more points against LSU than they did. And a lot of times with Nick Saban coach teams, the more potent the offense that they're facing, the more points they score, except in games where you're playing somebody like Vanderbilt who's just atrocious defensively. That's kind of the way it works out. And that's why the Colorado State games where Alabama has them overmatched, but they're still playing a competent opponent, tend to be close-ish games around a 20-point win. And I think that's kind of what I expect to happen here.
It's funny you mentioned that because if Alabama punches that in at the very end, then our model goes 3-0 last week against the spread instead of 2-1. But that's neither here nor there.